வணக்கம், குட் ஈவினிங், நமஸ்காரம். தமிழ் பாரம்பரிய அறக்கட்டளையின் மாதாந்திர சொற்பொழிவுக்கு உங்களை அன்புடன் வரவேற்கிறேன். வீட்டில் எல்லோரும் முடங்கி கிடக்கும் இந்த இக்கட்டான நிலையில் இணையத்தின் மூலம் 2வது மாதமாக இந்நிகழ்ச்சியை நடத்துகிறோம். போன மாதம் பேராசிரியர் சுவாமிநாதன் கல்ச்சர் ஸ்கேப்பிங் என்ற தலைப்பில் உரையாற்றினார். இன்று குஜராத்தில் மொடேரா என்னும் இடத்தில் உள்ள சூரியனார் கோயில் பற்றி திரு ஷியாம் ராமன் உரையாற்றவிருக்கிறார். தமிழ் பாரம்பரிய அறக்கட்டளை கடந்த 10 வருடங்களுக்கும் மேலாக செயல்பட்டு கொண்டு வருகிறது. கிட்டத்தட்ட 120 சொற்பொழிவுகள் நடத்தி இருக்கிறோம், அதற்கும் மேல். எங்களுடைய இணையதளம் tamilheritage.in ஆகும். நீங்கள் முதல் முறையாக இந்நிகழ்ச்சியில் பங்கேற்கிறீர்கள் என்றால் எங்கள் இணையதளத்திற்கு சென்று உங்கள் மின்னஞ்சலை அளிக்கலாம். அந்த மின்னஞ்சல் மூலமாக உங்களுக்கு எங்களுடைய நிகழ்ச்சிகளை பற்றி எங்களால் தெரியப்படுத்த முடியும். ஷியாம் ராமன் with a postgraduate degree in
Shyam, you can continue, Shyam. Yeah, you can continue.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Is it clear?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Shiva and Badri, for that introduction, and Tamil Heritage Trust for inviting me to do this talk. A few quick introductory remarks. One, I'm not an expert on this topic. I am an enthusiast. And just a minute, I'll shut off the other distractions here. I'm an enthusiast here, so I stand on the shoulders, and very broad ones, of these people. Dr. Vipka Lobo from the from the German Berlin Institute of Art for Indian Arts, whose book, The Sun Temple at Modhera, is, if you're reading only one book or monograph, she very modestly calls it a monograph. So if you're reading only one book, and that's The Sun Temple at Modhera by Dr. Vipka Lobo. The late Dr. M.A. Dhaki, who has written a monumental encyclopedia of Indian architecture. Much of the work, both the architecture of Modhera, comes from him. Of course, the wonderful Dr. Kirip Mankudi, who's done a lot of good work, including writing the ASI book on Modhera. He's been a guide and a source of inspiration for all of us. So these are some of the leading lights on this topic of Modhera. There are, of course, other authors who worked on it and made a number of interesting observations. Today's talk, I have material for maybe about 75 minutes to a little longer. So maybe a good idea to get yourself a cup of coffee and settle down in a comfortable place, and then I can sort of ramble on for some time. This is the Sun Temple at Modhera. It's quite a magnificent site. Very briefly, it consists of what is known as the temple and the Guda Mandapa. Guda Mandapa simply means a closed mandapa that is there. So this is your temple and this is your Guda Mandapa. Then there is the Ranga Mandapam or the Nritya Mandapam. This is a dance hall. And what is the difference between the Guda Mandapa and this is that this is an open hall, open on all 4 sides, and this is a closed hall where it's only one entrance. It's an east-facing temple. Then there are in front of these, at the east extreme of this complex, you have these 2 Kirti Stambhas, which are also the pillars of a Torana, and we'll see some Toranas later on. There is a large tank. It's a huge tank. It's not as small as what you see here. It's a fabulous tank. And it's been maintained very well by the ASI. So even though we call it the ruins from the 11th century, There are only really two things that are missing. One, there is no roof or no shikara or vimana that you may expect in a temple. And secondly, there is no idol in the sanctum sanctorum. So the sanctum sanctorum is empty. There are some ancient broken pieces of a pedestal and so on that is kept at a subterranean level at a basement below the sanctum sanctorum, but that is normally locked and ASI does not allow visitors there. So apart from the fact that these two, the roof and the idol are not there, it's a very well maintained place. I must mention that the good work that ASI is doing, because ASI found it like this, and this comes from the 1914-15 report of the ASI, and wherein they called it the Surya Narayana temple at Modhera, and say further care has been bestowed upon the exquisite though much ruined temple of Surya Narayana, and so for the last 100+ years ASI has been bestowing its care upon this site. What we will be looking at today are elements of architecture of the temple. There are lots of it to talk about. We will look at its unique sculptural program. It has a fairly unique set of sculptures on the walls, outside walls of the temple. Just to give you a closer look at those wonderful sculptures. We will look at iconography of the three main sets of sculptures that are there on the temple walls. We will look at the ranga mandapa and its absolutely exquisite pillars. We will look at the tank, which is the Kunda, the Surya Kunda or the Ram Kunda, and its 108 shrines, which is another very spectacular, as spectacular as the temple itself. We will look at all of that. This is, of course, a view of Modhera dressed up for the annual dance festival, which the Gujarat government sponsors, the Modhera dance festival. So we will explore these themes, the place, the period, the architectural style, the sculptural program around it, the iconography of the Adityas, the gauris, and the dikpalas. And while this looks like a simple list, we will take a lot of detours from here and there to understand and explore some of the background information behind each of these. So as I mentioned earlier, it's going to be a ramble. As our founder, Professor Swaminathan, often mentions, the objective of the presentation is not to cover everything, but to uncover a few things so that you can then go ahead and discover the rest. That's the spirit with which the talk will be about. So let's look at Modhera, the place. Just to let you know, I'm not a native Hindi speaker, so my the and the get mixed up. So this is how it is spelled. It's Modhera, the place, and there it is. It's in Gujarat. It is in the northern part of Gujarat. If you take a closer look at Gujarat, this is where it is. There is Ahmedabad, Gandhinagar complex, and then there is Mehsana. In the Mehsana district, Modhera is part of the Mehsana district, close to a place called Patan, which plays an important role in the history of Modhera. Modhera was an ancient religious and cultural center. There is proof, archaeological proof, that it has been settled at least from the Kshatrapa period, that is the 2nd century AD. The earliest mention of Modhera in literature happens from the 7th century onwards, in a Jain text, where it's referred to as Modhera. But importantly, the mention of a place in many languages, of many communities, of many religions, is what is an indicator of how important that place was in history. And Modhera has no shortage of mentions in history. So in old Sanskrit, it's called Modheraka. It's there in Prakrit. It is even there in Mandher. It's called Mandher in Persian. It is there in Apabhramsa. It is there in later Sanskrit. And of course, being at the heart of Gujarat, there is a Gujarati name for it as Modheron. So all of these are names that appear in texts about the place. Modhera is also important because, as I mentioned, it's very stayed close to power. The mention of a place in many languages, of many communities, of many religions, is what. Oops, I don't know how that came to me. So, yeah. So Modhera has also remained close to power for something like 420 years, because it's just about 35 kilometers from what is known as Anahilavada Patan. Anahilavada Patan was the capital of first the Chavdas, that is the Chapotkatas, somewhere in the middle end of the 9th century, and up to the 14th century, Patan remained the capital of that area of Gujarat. It was also the headquarters. Modhera was the headquarters of a subdivision under this Patan. Way back in 1000 AD, Patan was supposed to have had a population of about 100,000 or so, which makes it one of the largest cities in the country. Today, Patan is known for its patola saris and also for the Rani Ki Vav, which is a magnificent stepwell that is now a UNESCO heritage site. Continuing the theme, Modhera is also the place of origin of two Vamshas, the Mod Vamshas. One of them are the Mod Brahmins, who are therefore making Modhera a Brahminical Tirtha from ancient times. The other is the Mod Vanikas or Vaishyas, who were originally, most of them, Jains. There was a Mod Gacha of Jains there, which is now extinct. There happens to have been a temple to Mahavira there as well, which also has disappeared. But by the 15th, 16th century, most Jains apparently had migrated to either central India or converted to Vaishnavism and then become Mod Vaishyas. And the most famous of them all being Mahatma Gandhi, who was a Mod Vanya himself. So that is the importance and historical significance of Modhera in the history of Gujarat and that area. We'll now move on to the period of the Modhera Sun Temple. This slide is not upside down, but this is how, certainly not in English, this is how an inscription appears at the back of the Sanctum Sanctorum of the temple, the main temple. Obviously, it is not there, it was not placed like this. While some kind of reconstruction was happening, it must have been placed upside down like this inadvertently. But it also gives us an indicator of the date, which is Vikrama Samvat 1083. The Vikrama Samvat, as you all know, commenced in the 57 BC, so we minus 57 to sort of bring it to our current dates, and therefore in the current calendar it will be 1025, 1026 AD. So 1025, 1026 AD, Modhera was already there. Now the 11th century, the early 11th century was a period of great change in India, political change, empires changed. So as you can see, the entire north of India was dominated by the Gurjara Pratiharas in the 10th century. It became fragmented into a number of kingdoms here, the Chauhans, the Paramaras, the Palas, and so on and so forth. Similarly, the south, which was dominated by the Rashtrakutas, went over to the western Chalukyas or the Kalyani Chalukyas, and then the eastern Chalukyas or the Vengi Chalukyas. And our area, the area that we're discussing today, was then ruled by, in the early 11th century, late 10th century, by a set of people called, the dynasty called the Solankis. The Solankis were also known as Chalukyas. Chalukyas started off initially in the south around Badami, so they were the oldest Chalukyas. They were called the original Chalukyas. They were the Badami Chalukyas. A portion of them went to Vengi, became the eastern Chalukyas. The other set went to Kalyani, became the Kalyani Chalukyas. There is a set of Chalukyas in South Gujarat known as the Lata Chalukyas, but the people that we are now talking of are the Solankis. So who are the Solankis? Solankis actually refer to themselves as Chaulukyas, which may have derived from Chalukya, but basically they call themselves Chaulukya, and then the vernacular converted it into Solanki. They have an origin myth that the gods asked Brahma to protect them from certain demons. Brahma created a hero from his chuluka being a pot or a hollowed palm, which was filled with Ganga water, and this hero was called Chulukya, and therefore became the progenitor of the Chaulukya dynasty. There is a subsequent myth as well, but that is a later legend from the Paramaras in the neighboring Madhya Pradesh area, where the Solankis are seen as Agnikula Rajputs, along with Chauhans, Parihars, Parmars, and Solankis. But that is a later myth that came in around the 10th, 11th century. So Chaulukyas ruled Gujarat from the 1940s till about 1250 or so. They were established by somebody called Mulraj Solanki, who was an adopted son or some kind of a relative of the Chavda dynasty. that is the Chapot Katas. He adopted the title of Gurjaresh, from where today we now have Gujarat. The capital was Anhilwada Patan. They were patrons of Somnath temple, and these were the Solanki rulers of Gujarat. Now, Bhimadeva the first was the person ruling this area between 1021 and 1063, and therefore, even though there is no inscriptional or other direct evidence that Modhera Sun temple was built by him, because he was the ruler around the time that is found on the walls, and because of the style that is there, architectural style, the Modhera Sun temple is assigned to Bhimadeva. 1025, 1026, many of us may not have heard of Bhimadeva before, but we would have heard of another person who made 1025, 1026 fairly famous notorious in the history of India, and that is Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni. And 1025, 1026 was the year in which Mahmud decided to raid Somnath. He came in exclusively to raid Somnath with no other objectives of territory or any other gain. So he set off from Ghazna on October 18th of 1025. By November 9th, he was in Multan. By early December, he was in Lodorwa, a fort near Jaisalmer. And by late December, he was in Anilwada Patan. Now you may say, how do you say he was in Patan? Wasn't there a king of the Solankis there, Bhimadeva? Bhimadeva knew that Mahmud was coming all the way to go to Somnath, which is here, and Patan is on the way. So Bhimadeva essentially fled from Patan, leaving the people of Patan to the tender mercies of Mahmud, and he went off to a place to escape this whole thing, to a place called Kanthkot, which is in Kutch. After a few days at Patan of replenishing his stocks and water and food, Mahmud set off again, but was stopped at Modhera by a local army of chieftains. Some say up to 20,000 people fought the Afghan army at that time. But they were no match for Mahmud's forces, so they were scattered very easily. So the Sultan made his way all the way to Somnath. On 6th January, he entered the place. He was there for about 15 days. While he was there, he heard news that along the route that he had taken, the Jats and the Rajputs were sort of preparing to oppose his return, because now he'll be returning not just empty-handed, but with the loot from Somnath. So he decided to take a different route and go via Kutch and Sindh back to Ghazna. So which meant he marched straight into the port of Kanthkot, where our good friend Bhimadeva was sitting and cooling his heels. So Bhimadeva had to run away from Mahmud not once but twice, and this time he made his way back to Patan, while Mahmud, the Sultan, went back to Ghazna. And by April 2nd, he was there, though taking a much more circuitous and more difficult route through the deserts of Sindh and to the run of Kutch. So that is the story of 1025-26. And you may ask, how do we know all this, like some running commentary, minute by minute kind of thing? And that's because of this gentleman, Farooqi. Farooqi was a panegyrist, a court poet of the Afghan court of Sultan Mahmud. And Farooqi was with the Sultan, who accompanied him on the visit to Somnath, on the raid to Somnath. And he has written extensively, not extensively, he has put in a few sentences about Modhera, what he saw at Modhera. And I'd like to read that out. And this is where Mondher, the Persian word, comes in. A place where there was a tank, such a one at which the two eyes of thought were indeed dazzled. Such a tank that however I might contemplate, I cannot adequately express its qualities. It bore the signs of excellence of people. It gave indication of abundant riches. It was wide and an expansive tank with 100,000 acts. We don't know what that act means. And around it are 1,000 small temples. Well, the tank still exists, and maybe there are not 1,000 temples, but there are 108 temples. This is the tank. So this tank, still known as the Surya Kund, and earlier as Ramakund, is from north to south about 176 feet, east to west about 120 feet. One of the most magnificent tanks. It's not a step well, it is a tank, a kund, and it's one of the most magnificent tanks in probably all of South Asia. This gives an overall panoramic view. However, the intensity of the architecture and the sculpture around it can be felt only when you're sitting or standing at the bottom steps, somewhere like that, and then you see how big the tank is and just to give you a reference, this is a gentleman standing here, there is another man standing here. That's how deep the tank is. And if you were to stand at the somewhere in the bottom of the steps, he is surrounded by what Faruqi felt was 1,000 temples. He also said, Faruqi, that in front of this tank is a big temple, and in the midst of it, that is inside, is an image with the beauty of the moon, but with the stature of a cypress tree. So a huge but beautiful statue or an icon was there. So this establishes clearly that both the tank and the temple, in some form, existed in 1025-26. The main idol was probably damaged by the invaders. The temple was rebuilt afterwards. And incidentally, Somnath, which was sacked completely by Mahmud, was rebuilt between 1027 and 1030. So that is the historical background of the Modhera Sun Temple. It's been part and parcel of the history of Gujarat for a century now, for 1,000 years now. We move on to the next bit, the most beautiful part of it, which is the architecture. In general, as you all know, architecture of a place is the result of the history and geography of the place, and it's normally named after the dynasty which patronized a certain style. So typically you have the Pallava architecture, early Chola architecture, you have Chalukya architecture, Hoysala architecture, and so on. So similarly, the architecture of the Solankis was unsurprisingly referred to as the Solanki style for many years until Mr. M.A. Madhusudan Dhaki, who, as I mentioned earlier, wrote co-authored the Encyclopedia of Indian Temple Architecture, among other works, gave it a more specific name. He said, yeah, it's Solankis, no doubt, but it is what, after a lot of study, is what he would call a Maru Gurjara style. So this is the map of Gujarat, and there is Rajasthan here. So in his studies, it turned out that there were three different styles that were overlapping here. In the south, there is the Saurashtra area. There was a Saurashtra style, which sort of faded after some time. In the north, there was the Mahamaru style. The name again was given, the Maru style name was given by Mr. Dhaki. And somewhere along here is the Mahagurjara style. This is where Modhera is. So Modhera was practically bang in the middle of these three styles of temple architecture. And over a period of time, the kings, the Solanki kings, whose domain extended all the way from Saurashtra to much of parts of southern Rajasthan, decided to build in a style which merged both the Maru and the Gurjara style, and therefore you have the Maru Gurjara style. So the Maru Gurjara style was used not only by Hindus in Hindu temples, but extensively by Jains across, and still continues to be used everywhere, not only in India, but even when Jains build temples overseas, they use the Maru Gurjara style. Now that we have a name, what exactly is the Maru Gurjara style? So we'll look at what the Maru Gurjara style is based on its, we'll take a look at the plan, we'll take a look at the elevation, and we'll take a look at some of the decorative elements that are there that make it such a visual treat for anyone who sees this. So this is a plan, and we'll use the Modhera temple as the example of the prime Maru Gurjara architecture. So this is a plan. Typically, a temple in the Maru Gurjara style has a Mula Prasada or Garbhagriha, which has a Garbhagriha in the middle. That is a sanctum sanctorum. Prasada simply means temple. It could mean palace, any important building. Then there is a Guda Mandapa, which simply, as I said earlier, is a closed mandapam. It's a hall. It normally has an entrance through which you enter to reach the Garbhagriha. It is connected to the Garbhagriha by means of a passageway, and it's closed to the other sides. Then there is a Nritya Mandapa, which is a small independent dancing hall or performance hall or Ranga Mandapa, whatever you may want to call it. In the case of Modhera, this is an independent standalone feature, but in many subsequent Maru Gurjara temples, you will find it is connected. Not only that, if there is a lot of space in front, you may find yet another mandapa here, again connected by another passageway. So there is the Garbhagriha and the Mula Prasada, and then there is a Guda Mandapa, and then a series of other mandapas, which is typical of the Maru Gurjara style. In many of such temples, there is also a large kund, and you can see from the plan that the Surya Kund is is itself a spectacular of a spectacular size compared to the size of the temples. Right? So there we are. This is your Mula Prasada, this is your Kuda Mandapa, this is your Ranga Mandapa, and this is your tank. Unlike many other Maru Gurjara temples, this temple is built on an entire terrace. So the terrace is normally referred to as the Jagati. So the Modhera temple is built on a Jagati. We know historically that the Kund was there in 1025-26. That has been from Paruki. So that was built first. It's already there and probably was contemporary with the temple. But the temple in its current case was current style and form was rebuilt after the visit of Sultan Mahmud. And the Ranga Mandapa, the Nitya Mandapa, was built maybe another 30-40 years later, or maybe even 50 years later. There is a substantial proof of why this was sort of squeezed in between the main temple and the tank. So this is in terms of period, these two came first and the Nitya Mandapa came later. So that's the plan, and if you want an official looking plan. And what is the elements in the plan of a typical Maru Gurjara temple? A typical Maru Gurjara temple is simply orthogonal in plan. That means it is made up of right angles. You can say it looks so fabulous, it looks so rich and so on, but it's just made up of a bunch of right angles. So how do you get such a pretty picture with just a bunch of right angles? So if you take this corner of this right, so if you take this corner of the temple, let us see how it develops. So you have So you have what is known as a Bhadra as one side, you have a Karna, which is the corner. So this is the basic elements of any Maru Gurjara temple. In the plan, there is a Bhadra, which is also known as a Ratha, and there is a Karna. Karna simply means corner, as most of you will know. So there is a Bhadra here, there is a Bhadra here as well, right? So Bhadra, Karna, Bhadra. So you sort of put two of those together, you have Bhadra, Karna, and you have just two elements to this temple, and it's called a Dvi-anga temple, correct? So Dvi-anga temple. Yeah, so this is obviously a Tri-anga temple. So between the Bhadra and the Karna, you introduce another element, right? And that is called a Pratirata. The Bhadra, as I told you, is called a Ratha, and this is called a Pratirata, or accompaniment to the Ratha, or a companion to the Ratha, and that comes between the Bhadra and the Karna. So here again on all sides, the Karna, Pratirata, and Bhadra. So this obviously is known as a Tri-anga because it has three parts to this temple. Now, you can have a Pratirata that is sort of almost flat, without much depth, with a certain dimension. You can then add to those dimensions by making a deeper Pratirata. You can have Karnas and so on. So this is also a Tri-anga, but because the Pratirata is now deepened, it looks like it has many more Angas. You can do more funny things with it. You can give it a chamfer, so to speak, and you can put in certain decorative elements and make it look more and more dramatic than the simple rectangles or right angles may suggest. Obviously, there are ways to make it Chaturanga and Panchanga and so on, where you add more and more elements to everything between within the Bhadra and the Karna, and then repeat it on this side between the Bhadra and the Karna. Coming to Modhera, Modhera is a Tri-anga temple. From the plan, it has a Bhadra, it has a Pratirata, it has a Karna, and then that repeats. So here we are. If you want to look at the temple finally, so this is a Bhadra, and this is your Pratirata, and this is your Karna. Right? Similarly, that would be the Bhadra, and this would be the Pratirata. And this is not the Karna here. This is merely the passage between the main temple and the Kuda Mandapa. Maybe you can look at it from another side. So here we are, the Bhadra, the Pratirata, and the Karna. Again Pratirata, and this would have been a Bhadra, but it's an entrance, and then it repeats itself and so on. So by altering the depth and the width of the three elements that they have created an effect of very rich and a sumptuous building. Yeah, so there it is, more Bhadras, more Karnas, more Pratiratas, as you can see, but finally just three elements, three Anga. Now, so that is the plan. What about the elevation? Now the elevation, if you look at it from the temple from front or from the sides, you have three parts. You have the plinth here, which is called the Vitta, and then you have the Pita, and then you have the Mandovara. So never mind all the names, but yes, essentially it's the three parts of the temple. The Mandovara is the wall, the one below that is the Pitam, and then there is the plinth. Not so simple. So just look at the plinth, just look at the Pita. The Pita goes up to here, the number of elements that are there. You have something called the Jadya Kumbha, you have something called the Karnaka, you have the recess here with the diamond patterns, you have then a small cornice here, it's called the Kapotika, then you have the Grasapatti, which is a series of Kirtimukha symbols that you can see there, and then you have the elephants. In many temples there are then a row of horses, and finally a row of human beings, which is the Narapita. So the Narapita, the Gajapita, the Grasapatti, and so on. So in the elevation, just reaching up to the Pita and not yet starting on the wall, we already have 7 different sets of moldings that provide the richness and the sumptuousness for the building. Where have we reached by completing the Pita? We have merely reached the inner floor of the temple. This is the Pita. The Pita is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 layers already there, and when we've just got up to the inner floor of the, so end of the Pita, the inner coincides with the inner floor of the temple. Then starts the temple wall, and obviously, as you can expect, the temple wall has 6 more elements. There are flat sections, there are rounded sections. This is the Kalasa, another recess, another Kapota, and then you have the entire Changa section, which is the for the sculptures and the framed niches, which is what we would call in South the Kostas. Here there are pillared niches. The pillared niches are called Ratikas in language of North Indian style. So we've finished 7 layers here. We've got 6 more, right? And we are not done yet. There's another 6 that moves on above the Mandovara, which is the wall. So you start with the plinth, you finish the Pita, you have the wall, you have the Janga, and then you continue with more elements. So therefore, the richness of the entire temple architecture comes from the number of layers. So you have something like 20 layers between the floor and the roof of moldings, of carvings, of features, each one unique, each one different from the other. And then there is the Janga itself with its sculptures, and in the case of Modhera, and similarly in many other Maru Gujarat, in many South Indian temples, you may just see the Koshta and one Devata here. But here the Koshta itself is further divided. There is a main deity here, there is a smaller upper panels with smaller gods, there is a lower panel with the Apsarases and some cases ascetics, and the whole thing has a fairly planned, complicated, complex look. The Modhera temple has something like 34 such panels, 11 each on the long side and 6 each on the broad side, and we will see some of them in detail as we go along. We talked of those sculptures, but remember here in the Bhadra here, there is a need to have a window. So do we do away with the sculpture? No sir, we are Maru Gujarat architects, and therefore we will push the sculptures down below here so that we don't miss out on any aspect of the decorative elements, even though we have other elements here like the window itself. And you can see in the windows there are Purnagata pillars or Gata Pallavas, which are themselves style statement. So the Mula Prasada and the Guda Mandapa share this entire elevation pattern right across. So there is no change except for this where the window comes. Otherwise the Vitta, the Pita, and the entire wall and above that, these two share. But when it comes to the Ranga Mandapa, the share, the commonness stops with the Pitam. The Pitam has the same 7 elements, but above that, because the Ranga Mandapa is an open, light, airy structure and not such a heavy structure like the Mula Prasada, it is given a different set of elements, and then the open air, and then those wonderful pillars that we're going to see more of. And on the other side of these pedestals, you will see that there are seats for people to sit on and watch any performance that may be happening at the Ranga Mandapa. So that was the plan, that was the elevation. We saw the plan is orthogonal, but just 3 elements, they've sort of given us the right proportions. We saw that there are something like 20 layers between the floor and the roof of the temple in terms of the elevation. But there are other elements that go to make up the rich elements, the rich view, the look of the architecture of a Maru Gurjara temple. And one of them is the pillars. Inside the Ranga Mandapa and inside the main temple as well, the main temple is not lit as well because this is open. You get better pictures here if you go there. There are spectacular pillars, right? And not only that, they also have very elaborate ceilings there. You can see a wonderful ceiling there that is there, and other elements like the capitals of the pillars and the famous flying Toranas that are there. So let's take a quick look at the pillars first. So these are the pillars. Pillars are normally referred to as Mishraka pillars. Mishraka simply means composite or mixed pillars. That is, it is not just a square pillar or a circular pillar or an octagonal pillar, but it has multiple features on it. So it starts off with a circular pillar, with a circular section, a circular drum, where you have leaves and snakes and flora and fauna represented. Then there is a 16-sided drum where you have dancers and musicians. Then you have another 16-sided drum, but longer this time, taller, with narrative scenes, mostly from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana stories. And then you have these apsaras on a much taller 16-sided drum, right? But we are not done yet. The base is octagonal. So in one pillar, you have a circular section, 3 different 16-sided sections with different heights and different narratives, and finally an octagonal base. In between, there are elements, cushion elements, pillow elements, and so on. So all of these are sculpted. Every millimeter is sculpted and has carvings in it. And we can see 1 or 2 of them. For instance, this is from the Ramayana. You can see Ravana dressed as disguised as an ascetic coming to Sita, and then they fly away in the Vimanam. You have Hanuman here, Sita in the Nandavanam, Ashoka Nandavanam in Lanka. These are just examples. This is Krishna with the Govardhana Giridhari. These are the Yadava women who are churning milk there. This is Bhima battling Duryodhana and finally vanquishing him. So these are just a few samples. I've taken them from Twitter actually. Surprisingly, there is somebody called Gurpreet Chopra who seems to have done a very nice thread on Modhera itself. Worth your while to go and see it. So these are the narrative elements in the pillars. Above the pillars, you can look at the arches. These flying arches are another specialty of the Maru Gurjara style. They are there, especially in most Jain temples. You can see them. If you live in Mylapore and you're on your way to Kapaleshwara, there is a Jain temple, and you can see the flying arches there as well. So these are the flying arches. They are placed between the pillars, and when they are put outside the building, they become Toranas. Inside the building, they are just arches between pillars. Then there are these ceilings within the mandapa, and the ceiling themselves are of 3 types. There is a flat ceiling known as Samatala Vitana, and then there is a Shipta or recessed Vidana. So the flat ones are again fully carved, and then the recessed ones have lotus petals and so on. And finally, there is this concentric corbelled ceiling, which is now, any Jain temple, if you go to Dilwara temple or Mount Abu and so on, you will find this whole range of Maru Gurjara mandapas with absolutely fabulous ceilings. Ceilings are mostly lotus petals and so on, and as you can see, each of them has a carved animal or god or deity here, and these have been replaced later, and therefore they don't have some of these ceiling features. The Maru Gujarat architects also have fabulous doorways, very often of 5 or 6 parts. Each of this is a Rekha 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They also have excellent Lalata Bimbams, where that is the images on the top of the doorway, the lintel there. And you can see more of the flying arches distributed everywhere. So, we saw this, we saw the elevation, we saw pillars, we saw ceilings, we saw doorways. We haven't spent time on some of the decorative elements. There are gavakshas, there are kirtimukas, and there are so many other elements which all go up to make this profusion of sculpture and architecture and design in the Maru Gujarat temple. But one thing was missing, right? What was missing? Obviously, you know what is missing. What is missing is there was no shikara. Normally, we are used to, when we see a temple, the first thing that hits us is the shikara of the temple above the Garbhagriha. But because that has either fallen off, most likely in the earthquake, probably in an earthquake, because this is an earthquake-prone region, but it was never rebuilt. But we can sort of imagine how it would have been. And to do that, maybe we'll take a quick detour into what North Indian or Nagara style shikaras look like. So South Indian eye, they all look very similar, right? They all look tall and curved, but we don't know exactly sometimes what exactly they are. The Nagara temples have typically 3 or 4 styles. And the first style is what is known as a Latina or Lata, based on the word Lata, is also called Rekha. Simply straight lines up the tower, right? Then you have what is known as the shekari. This is, you take small shikaras and put them at various levels. Small shikaras, large shikaras, and so on, around the main shikara. And so you have a shekari, meaning made up of multiple shikaras. You can take the same shikaras and put them all in rows of levels. And these levels are known as bhumis, and therefore these temples are known as bhumija temples. Right? Again, as I said, they all look very similar to the normal person, to the layman. Then there is a wedge-shaped Hamsana ceiling or vimana, which is normally not used frequently for the Garbhagriha itself, but is often used for the Ranga mandapam or any similar mandapas that you have. Let's quickly take a look at each one of them. This is a Latina vimanam, just straight lines all the way up. This is a shekari one with shikaras piled one on top of the other, but at various levels and of various sizes, giving that wonderful impact there. This is a Bhumija temple, the absolutely brilliant temple of Udayeshwara temple in Udaipur in Madhya Pradesh. One of the few Bhumija temples in that area still surviving, where the same shikaras are arranged in bhumis or levels all the way up to the very top. And this is a Hamsana mandapa. This is not in Gujarat or Madhya Pradesh, this is in Odisha. But you can see that the temple, the Garbhagriha normally has a Latina vimanam or a shikara, while the Ranga mandapam has a Hamsana. Even now that we know all this, how would Modhera have looked if the shikaras had remained? Well, somebody had the same idea. So Percy Brown has made a drawing of this, and this is a drone's eye view of how Modhera would have looked with the shikaras on, and if they had not fallen off, it would have been quite a spectacular sight, an absolute treat to the eye, if it had remained. So that was about the architecture. So let's now move on to the sculptural program and the iconography of the Sun Temple. It's a unique, again, mix of icons that we have there. And though we don't have the main idol in the Sanctum Sanctorum, we have so many of them around the walls that it's well worth our while to spend some time there. Sun worship in India is very old. It goes back to the Vedic times, and In the original, in the Rig Vedas, Surya is one of the three original gods, Agni, Vayu, and Surya. Then even in Vedic times, multiple sun gods were there, right? And that's one of the features of the Modhera sun temple, the 12 Adityas. But that starts off in the Vedic times itself. Then in the epic times, the Mahabharata recognizes sun worshippers as a separate sect. Like you have Bhagavatas who worship Vishnu, we have Pasupatas and Shaivas who worship Shiva, and Saktas who worship Shakti. We have Sauras who worship Surya. The Mahabharata identifies Surya with practically all gods, Vishnu, with Rudra, with Brahma, with Indra, and so on. And in the epic times, Surya gets anthropomorphized. That is, he becomes more and more human. You know, his relationship with Kunti, that he starts having a family, he has wives, he has sons, daughters, and so on. In the Ramayana, Aditya Hridaya extols the sun god. And then the Puranas, the early Puranas, all of this sort of gets organized into specific stories. And by the late Puranas, we start having exclusively Saura Puranas that are basically based on Surya as the supreme entity. That is how sun worship in India has progressed over the centuries. There are famous sun temples all across the country, from the Martand Sun Temple in Jammu and Kashmir, right down to the Suryanar Kovil in the Tanjavur district. There are temples everywhere, east, west. There is in Assam. There is of course the famous Monarch Temple, and so on. So Sun Temple is a universal sun worship, and having temples to the sun for Surya are a universal phenomenon as far as India is concerned. And specifically in Gujarat, there probably were 100 sun temples all over the place. Again, just drawn this Google map, but these are all Koteshwar and Muli and Gop and Devsar, and were all places with either with sun temples now or had famous sun temples in the past. So sun worship in Gujarat has a long and distinguished history. Coming back to Modhera, we saw this was the plan of the temple and the Guda Mandapa. So what we have is around the temple, that is on the western side, we have Adityas. So remember you talked to the Bhadra, and this is the Pratirata, and this is the Karna. The Karnas around the temple are have dikpalas, or the gods of the directions. Right, the dikpalas, they are there in the Karnas. So here they are marked with L as Lokapalas. These Karnas, there is dikpala here, dikpala here, dikpala here, and there. The Pratiratas on the western side of the temple, that is the rear of the temple, have Adityas. Adityas, we'll find out about the Adityas in a minute. On the eastern side, they have a set of gauris or devis who are all goddesses with a similar iconography and so on. So these are the three main sets of icons on the external walls of the temple. So we start with the Dvadasa Adityas, the 12 Adityas. Again, Adityas are mentioned starting with the Vedas. Then the Shatapada Brahmana actually mentions Adityas as 12 Adityas. In the Ramayana, these 12 Adityas are seen as among the 33 sons of Aditi. Mahabharata actually specifies the 12 Adityas by name. Now, before that, Adityas have several names, but the 12 Adityas as a single set is specified in the Mahabharatas. Then the Puranas start giving you descriptions and iconographic details. And finally, there is one Shilpa Shastra, the Vishwakarma Shastra, which gives you the iconography of the 12 Adityas, what they should have and what are the aspects that they should have in their hands and so on. So the 12 Aditya concept has been there since the Vedic times, and over the period of times, especially starting with the 9th, 10th centuries, it started getting, so these are the 12 Adityas. The names are different in different texts. In the Rig Veda it is something, in the Brahmanas it is something, in the Puranas it is something else. But there are a few names which are common. Varuna, Mitra, Aryaman, Bhaga, Amsha, Dhatra, etc. are reasonably common across the times. But over the centuries, the 12 Adityas kept changing, names kept changing. 12 Adityas are supposed to represent the 12 aspects of Surya. And, Surya as Indra, for instance, destroys the enemies of gods. Surya as Pushan makes the food grains grow. Surya as Bhaga is in the body of all living beings. Surya as Varuna is in the waters, and so on and so forth. But by the time we come to the Vishnu Purana, this whole 12 Adityas thing is fully fleshed out, with each Aditya having a specific month of the year assigned to him. Each Aditya then having a Rishi to chant the Vedas, a Yaksha to harness the horses, a Gandharva to sing his praises, an Apsaras to dance, a Rakshasas to push and help with the chariot, and a Naga or a Sarpa to protect the Aditya. So the 12 Adityas are now fully official and fully well described in the Vishnu Purana. We won't go into the details of each of these names, but it is a very well developed system of the 12 Adityas. Naturally, something that is so well developed gets on to the sculptural art of the temples, and here is one which is probably from the Malwa area in the 10th century, and this is one way of depicting all the 12 Adityas together in a single panel. So you have some of these Adityas are standing, some of them are seated, and then there is a main sun god Surya, as you can see, representing the 12 Adityas together. Similarly, this is from the Junagadh Museum in Gujarat. Again, 12 Adityas, they are all Adityas here, and there should have been a main deity here as well. But in Modhera, it is unique that the 12 Adityas are as standalone gods across. They are not in a single panel or a single Torana or anything. They are across the entire temple, and this is how they appear almost everywhere. So what are the iconographic features of an Aditya? An Aditya posture is normally straight. An Aditya in this case shares almost all features with Surya. So Surya icon will share all of these features. Surya icon is always shown, especially now, in Samabhanga, that is standing straight. Surya icon typically has two arms. As you can see, in most of the Modhera Adityas, the arms are broken. The lotus has been associated with Surya from very early times as a symbol of both time and fertility that Surya brings to the earth. Therefore, lotus is a clear indicator of Surya, and normally the lotus is shown at the shoulder height, shoulder level. In South Indian iconography, the hand itself will be at shoulder level, but in many of the North Indian Suryas, the hands will be holding onto stalks of lotus, and the stalk will wind up, and the lotus will be at the chest or the shoulder level. Suryas have Kirita Mukuta like Vishnu does. He has Kundalas. Some of the Suryas have a Srivatsa symbol in the middle of their chest. It's a kind of a little diamond or a swastika that is there. They have Haras. They have a Yajnapavitam that is worn. They have an Uttariyam come Vanamala come something, but which has been described in the text as a Pralamba Hara, a long haram or a long necklace. But in the Modhera temple, these have been described. These have been shown almost like a Vanamala. Apart from this, there are people and animals and divine beings around Surya. The Vidyadharas are always shown on the top. Then there are two attendants called Dandi and Pingala. The Pingala should be pointing here. This is wrong here. The Pingala is the keeper of records, and Dandi is the measurer of the world. He is normally shown with a staff, and Pingala is normally shown with a notebook and a pen or a scribing something. In addition to that, we have 7 prancing horses. Aruna is the charioteer of Surya. Aruna is very often shown only up to the chest. We are not shown his legs ever, normally not shown. Aruna. And then we have two more people here, normally shown as dancers. These are Rajni and Nikshubha, who are in some texts his dancers and attendants, and some texts his wives. You will also notice that there are two goddesses named Usha and Pratyusha, who are the goddesses of dawn. Normally they have a bow and an arrow from which they are shooting at the darkness, shooting light at the darkness. In the case of the Modhera temple, Usha and Pratyusha are shown in these two Ratika pillars, stand beside the Aditya. For instance, even this lotus, which should be held in his hand, is shown on the pillar. We saw these two dancers here. So in all the 12 Adityas, you will find that these horses, you will find Dandi and Pingala, you will find Aruna. But sometimes these two dancers here, the Rajini and Nikshubha, are replaced by Ashwins. The Ashwins were considered sons of Surya. So they replace the dancers here. The 7 prancing horses have later been given the names of 7 Sanskrit Chandas, meters, Gayatri and so on, Ushnik, Trishtub, Anushtup and so on. Those are the names of the horses that are given to the horses. So that is a typical Surya iconography. I'll leave you for a second to just take it in. Obviously, the 2 arms are missing. But the most curious part of, or most fascinating part of Surya in North India is really this element. Suryas and the Adityas in this case are shown wearing high boots. And they're also shown wearing something called an avyanga, which is a girdle come belt worn high up in the waist here. How did Surya get his boots? This is his armor. You can see that Surya is not bare-chested anywhere. It's an armor that is there, and here is the avyanga that he's wearing, and there are his absolutely very well-made boots. There are Surya sculptures with even more fancy dandy boots as well. So, question is, how did Surya get his boots? You go to a Purana called the Samba Purana. Samba was the son of Krishna, who was cursed for some reason to suffer leprosy. And Samba then had to find out how to cure himself of this leprosy. And Narada's advice is he worshipped the sun god. And he was then, in gratitude, wanted to build a temple for the sun god somewhere near present-day Multan on the banks of the Chandrabhaga river, which is considered the Chenab. But somehow no Brahmana was either ready to become a priest, or in some versions of the story, the sun god himself instructs Samba to go find priests for this temple from a sect of people called the Magas. And these Magas were sun-worshipping priests, and they came from a place called the Shakadvipa. As you all know, Bharatavarsha and our country is in Jambudvipa, and this is Shakadvipa. So Samba went to Shakadvipa and brought 18 families of Magas and installed them as priests of the temple. Lots of questions. Magas were basically the Magi of the biblical story. They were basically Zoroastrian, they were Persian origin sun worshippers. But where was Shakadvipa? When did they come to India? We know that they are not Shakas. The Shakas were Scythians, these were Indo-Iranians. How come they were accepted as Brahmins? Because in most texts, anybody from outside Jambudvipa is seen as a Blecha and not accorded high status. And how did they get Indianized into Surya? So these are questions that scholars are still writing nice articles about. But net, what happened was the Magas brought with them a certain set of iconographic features that got added on to the image of Surya. And so much so that by the time of Varahamihira in the 6th century Brihat Samhita, the persons who were known, who were to be called for installing an image of Surya, Brihat Samhita says they are called as the Magas. So you can see Vishnu or Bhagavatan, that is the people who install the priests of Vishnu are Bhagavatas, and Sambho is Bhasma Dvijan, that is Brahmins with ashes, that is the Pasupatas, ash smeared ones, and here, as you can see, it is Magamscha Savituhu. So the sun god has to be installed by Magas. It's a different story and a topic for another discussion, whether Vara Mihira himself was one of the Maga Brahmin. Not only that, Vrihad Samhita also describes what the idol of Surya should look like. And the idol should have a northern style. It says Uditya Vesham. Yeah, Uditya Vesham Gudam. So it has to be covered in an Uditya Vesham or the northern style that includes, so you can see the other things, 2 lotuses in his arms, a diadem, earrings and so on, but he should be covered with armor. And we saw the armor in the Modhera Aditya as well. So the Magas brought in the northern style of Uditya Vesham to what was essentially a Vedic god. And somewhere along the way, that got picked up sculpturally from the 2nd and 2nd century AD onwards. So from Gandhara, you have Suryas with boots, Kushan Suryas with boots, Gupta Suryas coming into the 5th century with boots. Finally, as we move on, 9th century Suryas with boots, 10th, 11th century Suryas in the Pala architecture, Eastern India with boots, Bangladesh Suryas with boots, and Konarak up to the 13th century with lovely boots. So the boots became a common part of North Indian Surya iconography. It never reached the south. So the South Indian Suryas, you can still count their toes if you'd like to. They don't wear boots, but the North Indian Suryas wear the boots. Was it always thus? So is Surya somebody we borrowed from the Persians and the Indo-Iranians and so on? Unfortunately, we don't have enough Hindu monuments of the period before these Suryas that I showed you. The earliest Surya that I showed you was in the 1st, 2nd century AD. But before that, we have Buddhist and Jain monuments. I won't go through all of them, but here is one in Bodh Gaya in one of the panels. And this is a Buddhist monument. And you have Surya here shown with Pratyusha and Usha with the bows and arrows and so on and so forth. So there was a Surya and a single-wheeled chariot. So there was the Surya iconography prior to the time of the Magas and the iconography that included the Uditya Vesham and the boots. Somewhere along the way, it seems to have completely taken over the iconography, and therefore Vedic god gets a northern or Uditya dress. There we are, coming back to Modhera, and that is the story of how Surya got his boots. We saw the Adityas. Now let us move on to the Devis or the Gauris. The myth of the Gauri, Parvati was Sati, and there was she was the daughter of Daksha Prajapati, and she was disowned by her father. She wasn't invited. She and Shiva were not invited for the sacrifice, and therefore she threw herself and killed herself in the sacrificial fire altar. Then she was reborn as the daughter of Himalaya as Parvati, and she did the Panchagni Tapasya, where she stood standing surrounded by the 4 fire altars, and the 5th Agni was the Agni in the sun, which is the sun in the sky, and finally she was reunited with Shiva. And that's the story of the Gauris. And the Gauris, again, the 12 Gauris are described, while there are multiple mother goddesses in the Shaivite tradition. The 12 Gauris are described in a text called the Aparajita Pricha, the Questions of King Aparajita, which is an iconographic text which was compiled at the Solanki capital of Anilwada Patan, somewhere in the 12th century. That is later, it was compiled later, but the ideas of 12 Gauris was well established by then. And these Gauris had different names: Uma, Parvati, Gauri, Lalita, Shriya, Krishna, and so on. They had specific iconographic features. All of them carried akshamalas. Some of them had lotuses. All of them carried kamandalas, and so on. And these is the closest textual reference we can get to the Gauris of Modhera. So in Modhera, all 12 Gauris that seem to have been talked about in the Aparajita Pracha are represented. They are all 4-armed. They are all in Tribhanga posture. They all have Varada Mudra and Akshamala. Many of them have Kamandalos and so on. So here we are with the Gauris. You can see them. You can look at many of them have Karanda Mukuta, that is a conical crown or diadem, or Jata Mukuta, which is typical of Shiva himself. They all have 4 arms. In the upper arms, the lotuses are held. The other arms would have had other aspects. We will see some of them. One side there is a lotus bud here, one is a full bloom lotus. They are all in Tribhanga posture. They too have the Vanamala. They have Vidyadharas around them. They have attendants and dancers. They have exquisite lotus petals and lotus pedestals, and you will see different lotus pedestals in different devis. But otherwise, the iconography is practically the same, barring the aspects that they may carry in their arms. So we will see the different aspects. Here is, for instance, one Devi with a Katwanga, which is a staff with a skull at the end of it. And you can see this lotus has some parrots in it, and so on. So here are the 12 Devis. The Devis, this one has a Sula or a Shakti. She has a Pasha or a noose. This one has a Trishula. This one has a bell and a Ganta. And you can see the Varada Mudra with the Akshamala. There, here the aspects are not very visible. We have the Ankusha, the Danda, a more beautiful Pasha. We have the thunderbolt, the Vajra, which is always represented as a thunderbolt here. We have one of the Devis carrying the Danda. And you can see the Kamandalus. Here is a very intricately designed Kamandalu. Here a more plain water pot. Right? Some with Trishulas, and here is the one that we already saw with Katwang. So these Devis are there in the eastern part of the half of the temple, outside the walls, and so on. And many of them, we can see the Karanda Mukutas and the Jata Mukutas reminding us of Saivite features as well. And therefore, Dr. Kirit Mankodi has an hypothesis, and he refers to 4 items. He says, look, the Adityas and the Gauris, if it's a purely sun temple, why give the Gauris, who are essentially consorts of Shiva, such importance as the Adityas? In fact, they are in the front of the temple, while the Adityas themselves are at the rear. So why would you give them so much importance? Secondly, there is one niche with a specific form of Bhairava. This is a Bhairava who is called an Atiriktanga Bhairava or a Tripada Bhairava. He has 3 feet. The front foot here is broken, but he has 3 feet, 3 faces, and 3 arms. Not 4. There are 3 arms. 1, 2, and 3. Right? You can see the 3 arms here. And 3 faces here are clear. So who is this? This is a form of Bhairava, and Bhairava is a form of Shiva. And there was no need to place him anywhere here in the same level as the Adityas and the Gauris, but it seems to have been done by intention. So there he is, near Ishana, the Dikpala. There is the Atiriktanga Bhairava with 3 feet and 3 faces. Thirdly, in the central niche of the doorway, in the Lalata Bimba, that is the lintel, this is a very poor photograph, I'm sorry, but you have Brahma, you have Vishnu, and you have Shiva in the center. Normally the lintel has the god that is inside the temple in the center. So if it's a Vishnu temple, Vishnu will be here. If it's a Shiva temple, Shiva will be here, and so on. So this lintel has Shiva here. So that's the third aspect. And finally, in the doorway of the Gudamantapa, that is here, I don't have a clear photo. These icons here are shown as mixes of Surya and Vishnu, Surya and Shiva, Surya and Brahma, and so on. So with all this, and from much other research in other temples which have Surya, Shiva combinations, Dr. Mankodi has hypothesized that and is more and more convinced that from his visits to other temples as well, that this is a temple not merely for Surya, but for some kind of a Saiva Surya or a Surya Shiva, like Surya Narayana, a combination of Surya and Saiva for whom this temple was built. In fact, his paper on this is titled very, very nicely, "To What God Shall We Render Homage in the Temple at Modhera?" So is it a sun temple or a sun Saiva, Shiva sun temple is something for scholars to decide. The last set of, we saw the Adityas, we saw the Gauris, and now the last set of cultures there are the dikpalas. So all of you know about the dikpalas. This is how they are distributed. The north is protected by Kubera, the northeast by Ishana, the east by Indra, the southeast by Agni, the south by Yama, Nirriti, Varuna, and Vayu. and this is how they are in the thing as well, in the temple as well. And here you can see that again, like we saw the Adityas, the dikpalas, who were actually, some of whom were actually the principal gods of the Vedic periods. Like Indra was much more frequently mentioned in all the Vedas than Vishnu and Shiva. And one of the great mysteries of Hinduism is how and when Vishnu and Shiva took over from Indra, the popular imagination. Agni and so on are all important Vedic gods who have been assigned the role of protection of the directions, and therefore they are well developed in terms of what is the weapon they carry, who is their vahana, who is their consort, which is the planet that they represent, who is the guardian, and so on and so forth. So here are a quick look at some of the dikpalas. Here we have Agni. Agni is very often shown with a mustache and a beard in many temples. So he carries a kapala here. There's no Padukam. He's there. He's having Pataka Hasta. His Vanamala is there. And there is some part of a ram which could be his Vahana. And there are attendants. He is standing in Tribanga. They all have 4 arms and so on. So that's Agni for you. This is Nirriti. Nirriti is always shown naked. He's also in Tribanga. You can see the snakes around his neck here as ornaments. 4-armed again. There are more snakes here. He has a Katihasta, and one of his left arm is placed on his thigh or hip, and he is wearing, sorry, this is not a snake, this is a mala of bones that he is wearing. But there are snakes here, you can see the snakes here coiling around Nirriti. His Vahana is Naravahana, so this is a human who is his Vahana. You can see Vayu, not much left of the icon of the image itself, but you can see that in one hand there's probably a lotus. His Akshamala is there in the Varada Mudra, and you can see the Mriga, the antelope or the deer, which is his Vahana. Here is Varuna with his Pasha or noose. Rest of it is mostly damaged. Can't make out much of the other features. The Ishana with the Jata Mukutam, Varada Mudra, and his Rishabha, a very muscular Rishabha. Though the face is gone, you can see the power of that bull standing here. Finally, Kubera, whose prosperity, unlike many of them who are all, slim and trim, here is Kubera with a not an ugly pot belly, but a hint of a pot belly just to show his prosperity. The rest of it, of course, has been damaged. So we come to the end of most of the presentation. We saw the place, Modhera and its importance. We saw the period. We saw the architectural style. We saw elements of the iconography. We found out how Surya got his boots. We saw the gauris and maybe why Modhera is actually a Saiva Surya temple. We saw the dikpalas. And you may ask me, look, all this is fine. What about coronavirus? And Modhera does not disappoint, right? So we talked of the Kunda, you remember, the Surya Kunda, and we had 108 shrines around it. Of the 3 main shrines, one is for Shiva and Nataraja, one is for Vishnu as Anantashai, but the third one is a Shitala Shrine. Shitala, this is the Shitala Shrine from behind. As you can see, this is the Kunda, and you can see that this is the shrine. Shitala is the god of the virus. She is the goddess of the smallpox virus. Shitala means cold, shivering, which is one of the symptoms of pox. The goddess both inflicts and averts the disease. So she is both malevolent as well as beneficent. And so you pray to her to say, don't give me the disease. Shitala has many predecessors, Hariti and Parnashabari in the Buddhist tradition, Bahuputrika and Ambika in the Jain traditions, Jeshta, Sashti, Chandamari, Mahamari, and so on in our own Hindu tradition, all of whom are goddesses related to children and disease. And they've all sort of, in a way, sort of synthesized into Shitala. Shitala is not Vedic, but she has been featured in the Puranas from as early as the 12th and 13th century. And therefore, this is the Shitala Shrine at Modhera. It is probably because of the association with the cooling waters. She could be on the steps of the sacred Kunda that is there. This is the Shitala icon. Shitala is normally shown nude. She's shown 12 or 6 or 8 or 12 arms. She's not a pretty sight. Even when she's fully there, here it's damaged. She's not shown as a beautiful lady. She's shown as a fairly ugly, not a non-attractive, I may say so. And her typical distinguishing features of Shitala are the Shurpa, the winnowing fan. There is a water pitcher or a kalasam that she has. There is her Vahana as an ass. And normally she would have a broom as well, which is missing from this particular icon. Though she has 12 arms, and most of the other arms, these arms are carrying these. And each of them has some kind of relationship to the box itself. The winnowing fan, the broom being clean and to eat healthy, the water pitcher being the cooling effect, and the Vahana, the ass, whose dung and ashes from whose dung and whose milk are all supposed to have some curative properties, and so on. Shitala also has some Saivite features. She carries a Trishula, she has a Damaru, and so on, has a Varadamudra, and so forth. But these are the more characteristic features of Shitala. And with that, we come to the end. Please pray to the goddess Shitala, other goddesses. Stay safe, and thank you for your patience in listening to this presentation on Modhera. Thank you very much. Over to you, Badri, or...
Yeah.
Thank you.
It was wonderful, Shyam. Outstanding presentation. To follow that right through, it's a privilege. And we were all, as part of the Tamil Heritage Trust, we had. Can you switch off your output at your end, Shyam? Yeah. So we were there at this venue, and you led us. You took us around. You had made an outstanding presentation before the site seminar itself, and now it's like revisiting the site seminar and the live visit to the site. Now we have people there watching this presentation on YouTube. I've asked them to present some questions. One of the questions that came earlier from Sridharan, archaeologist. So what kind of a stone is used here to build this temple?
It is I think it is a mix of sandstone. I will have to confirm that. I have the details somewhere, but it escapes me at the moment. It is sandstone.
Okay. We have visited Modhera, and on the west, and we have also been to Konark on the east. How do you compare? There, of course, Konark also we could only see parts of the temple, a gigantic, very large one. So, what features could you see sort of common, at least in iconography, in the Adityas, at least the 3 of them around? A few words on that.
I wouldn't have much detail, but as I showed you, an Aditya, a Surya from one of the niches of Konark. That's not the main idol, or it's not the idol. It's in Konark Museum as well. But the main features of a Surya, which is the lotus, the Kirita Makuta, and the entire paraphernalia that goes with it, are common to almost, as I showed, most of the country, and that has been replicated in Konark as well, right down to the boots. Of course, the sheer scale of Konark is something that gives pause, because we saw that Peetam in the architecture in Modhera, that Peetam in Konark is probably 10 feet above your head, and then the temple starts after the floor of the temple starts after that. So it's a completely different scale, and therefore, while the commonalities of the god and the iconography is there, the architecture-wise it is of a completely different scale, and therefore it's spectacular in its own way.
Our Professor Shankar Narayanan is saying, and I'll read it. You'll enjoy it. Excellent presentation. I think all the icons follow Aparajita Pricha. That is Dwadasa Aditya, Gauris, etc. are Atriktanga Bhairava. No, and he says Atriktanga Bhairava should be Harihara Martanda. That's scholarly input from Shankara Narayanan.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Ramki says it was in January 2014 that we visited Modhera. Just to remind us that it was 6 years back. I have another question. The in the Nagara style of architecture, you showed the elevation. Particularly in the Kunda in front, we can actually see full-fledged Nagara, complete temple there, right?
Correct. Yeah.
But is this its plan following exactly the here you have elevation and plan, whereas in the main temple we don't see the elevation, so that's why it comes to we have to go to what Percy Brown says, etc. But do they follow sort of similar plan? Because they look different from a typical Nagari.
Absolutely, because the plan determines the number of, the Shikara determines the number of Bhadras and Pratiratas, because that is almost always continued down into the wall of the temple. So, if you had this, for example, you have to go, let me go to just a minute. I don't know if you can still see this. Those Nagara. Yeah, so if you come here, this is what is continued into the wall.
Right.
So if you say there is a Bhadra, there is a Pratirata and a Karna, that is what determines the Shikara also has the same number of Angas, whether it's a Trianga or Chaturanga or Dviyanga, whatever. It starts here. So that is the influence that the elevation has on the plan, or the plan has on the elevation. So it is the number of Angas that are there. So that will continue right across. So for instance, here all the way down you can see. So here you can see it starting all the way from the bottom to give it that. We have been here as well.
Okay.
By not breaking up the wall and starting the Bhadras and the Pratiratas right all the way from here, you get a sense of verticality that may not be there if you broke this and put up a window here or put up something else here. So the number of Angas is determined right through and go all the way up to the topmost, the Amalaka that is there at the bottom.
Okay. Shankarnarayan also adds that the Sakat Kshatrapas are the very reason for merging of Surya with the Iranian icon. Gujarat could be the center of that, he says.
Quite possible. So the identity of who the Shakadvipas are is a lot of debate going on. Some people say Scythian. One thing is that they are not Shakas, even though it is called Shakadvipa. There is some theory that says, look, there could not have been a real Shakadvipa from which people came, because whether it was Yavanas who are Greeks, whether it was any other foreigners, they are all condemned in our literature as Mlechas. And there is no way they could have been given a situation where they are the priests of a temple.
Okay.
So therefore, these people, the Shakadvipa is probably this is one of the theories. Shakadvipa is probably a mythical region created so that these people have already migrated. Their origin myth is from one of those dvipas, just like Jambudvipa. In fact, I think it's in the Mahabharata where Shakadvipa has 5 sets of people like Maga Brahmanas are one of them. There are other communities that, sects that are there, and so on. So it goes back, and historians are divided as to who exactly the Shakadvipis are. However, there are a set of people today also who call themselves Shakadvipi Brahmins and Maga Brahmins. So they have, you can look them up on the web. They have their web page. They are all Surya worshippers. And of course,
Okay. There's one question which asks, does the water in the tank come from rain only, or is there a flow from underground?
I am not sure. I don't know.
Okay. Well, Ramki asks another question. Why should it be a shakari type instead of a Bhumija type?
Oh, no reason. Just Mr. Cousin's imagination that has come there.
Percy
We
Brown's.
don't know what was taken. There are no pieces of the temple there from which it has been put together. Yes.
Okay. Nandakumar Venkatraman asks, any idea how long it took to build the entire temple? Do you have any detail?
Really no, because there are fragments of sculpture that have been found around the temple, which are definitely prior to this period when this current form of temple. So it is in that old Maha Gurdwara style. We saw that Maha Gurdwara, Maha Maru, and the Saurashtra style. The old Maha Gurdwara style of iconography has found in those. So it is likely that the temple existed by the time of not likely. The temple definitely existed at the time of Mahmud of Ghazni in a slightly different form, and was therefore rebuilt after that raid and the damage that happened then. So if Somnath is supposed to have been rebuilt in about 3 odd years, to 1027 to 1030, we can guess that this probably took similar amount of time given the whatever finances were available. Of course, the peak of Solanki power expanded after that. So this was not the decline stage or the early stage. It was actually the peak of Solanki power, where in fact there is a myth that Bhimadeva went and defeated Raja Bhoja of Bihar as well, and so on. It is all contested and so forth. So they could have put in enough resources to build it fairly quickly.
There are a couple of questions from Krishna Kumar. Is it iconographically right to call him Tripada Bhairava? And the next is related to that is it similar to the Jwaradeva of South India?
Correct. In fact, that is the discussion that's going on. I thought I had shown it. I didn't mention it, I think. Just give me a second. So he is called Tripada Bhairava, and So sorry. So Lobo, Vipul Lobo actually calls it Jwara and says, Jwara is the other icon that is the image that has this Tripada kind of a situation. But what Dr. Mankodi says is, why put Jwara there? What is the logic?
Okay.
You can describe it and say it is Jwara, but why would I put a Jwara there? There is no particular reason for Jwara to exist there. So therefore, his thing is that it's a Bhairava and it is a Tripada Bhairava. That's it.
Another question from
I can also add that there are a number of other temples that I have not brought in all of that because it sort of lengthens the whole thing, that Dr. Mankodi has visited, and where this combination of gauris and Shiva are there. Therefore, there are evidences that are there all across Gujarat and southern Rajasthan from where he has picked it up and makes his case. It's a very solid case that he makes.
Okay. Only couple of minutes to close the talk. Are there any inscriptions around the temple tank? Asked by Gugan.
No, not that I am aware of. There are not many inscriptions. No inscriptions.
Okay. I have one question. The architectural, leave out the architectural style, the sculptural style of the Sun Temple Modhera and the Rani Ki Vav, which is also of the Solanki dynasty. There is, the sculptures are almost, identical in its form, the bend, the tribangam, the way, the fluidity there, etc. But in Rani Ki Vav, we don't see, I guess it's probably Vaishnava in nature. We don't see any of these icons or anything similar. I mean, that's what my memory tells me. Not any of Adityas or gauris or even dikpalas weren't there. Anything that you may want to add on that?
No, I cannot comment on why these sculptures are not there. All I know is Rani Ki Vav was said to have been commissioned by the Queen of Bhimadeva, who is assigned to this temple. his queen built Rani Ki Vav. Rani Ki Vav, why did Faruqi get so entranced by Modhera tank if he had seen Rani Ki Vav? Because Rani Ki Vav didn't exist then. Rani Ki Vav was built about 50 years later. So whether there was a change in the thinking of some of the iconography, I mean not the iconography, or what should be featured in it, it's possible. I don't know, but I can check with Dr. Manpuri, who's probably best placed, having written his magnum opus on Rani Ki Vav.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shyam, and all the people who have been following this talk on YouTube and also interacting with us by asking questions. We'll be again there with another talk next month, first Saturday, 5:30, same place. You will get a new YouTube link at that time. Thanks once again, all of you. Bye from us, Tamil Heritage Trust. Thank you.